Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Washington Post Intelligence Weekly Briefing. I'm Luiza Savage, Editorial Director of Washington Post Intelligence, and every Friday we convene our analysts and leaders across sectors for a single purpose: to get smarter faster. We like to think about this time as our weekly strategy session, an hour to really dial down the noise and focus on the intelligence that matters, the trends, the signals, the decisions that are shaping our economic and our geopolitical future. Washington Post Intelligence is a new kind of media. We've built it for executives and policymakers who need insight, not spin. So our subscribers receive concise intelligence reports that have actionable recommendations across AI and tech, energy and climate, global security, and soon healthcare. We offer a graphics library, exclusive interviews, and these live briefings where we pressure test important developments that are changing the business and policy landscape. So we want this to feel like the smartest meeting of your week and the start of your next strategic move. So today we're going to dive into an important policy development that is really coming around the bend to help you see whether you are in the energy business, use energy, or an investor or policymaker. We are going to look at what happens when the US government stops tracking our greenhouse gas emissions. This isn't just an issue for the climate movement. This will have impacts across the energy industry, for markets, and across different sectors of the economy. So we're going to get into all of that with our panel. First, I'd like to introduce Kathryn Clay. She's our new lead energy and climate analyst. Kathryn joins us from a long career that has spanned everything from a physics PhD to work on energy legislation as a staffer in both the House and Senate. And she's been an executive at industry associations across renewables, transportation, infrastructure, natural gas, and others. And in those roles, she's been always an analyst and a translator of government policy and how it reverberates across industry. And we're just so glad to have her on our WP Intelligence team. Welcome to your debut briefing, Kathryn.
Oh, thank you so much, Luiza. I'm so delighted to be here and to be joining this amazing team at Washington Post Intelligence, and so delighted to be here for my first briefing, as you say. The reason that I selected this particular topic on the greenhouse gas emissions program was because I believe that this was a very important story that was not getting the same kind of attention that some higher profile policy changes having to do with the energy, clean energy tax credits and how they fared under the One Big Beautiful Bill, some of the larger loan programs and how they've been renegotiated in the clean energy space by the Trump administration. This story hasn't gotten the headlines, and that belies the importance that it plays. When you first hear about a national database, that doesn't necessarily seem like it would be so fundamental and important. But in fact, this database of greenhouse gas emissions that the US government has kept for the past 14 years, in covering by the end over 8,000 different industrial facilities across the country and across sectors, it's become the de facto gold standard for emissions measurements in the country and was the basis for our reporting under the United Nations climate regime. The loss of the standard means that no matter what happens, we will have a gap, and the continuity and the trend lines are such an important part of the insights that people get from the greenhouse gas database. What I draw attention to in the report is that this is not just a scientific or academic endeavor. This database has real-world implications for businesses, including investors, including LNG exporters, and the carbon management industry. So I'm so delighted that we have the experts here, Luiza, to tell us more about that, and I just believe it's a very important conversation.
That's such a great introduction to what we're going to be diving into today. Thank you, Kathryn. And I'll introduce our additional speakers. Philip Moss is the founder of Blended Finance Group. He has spent his career creating financial frameworks and partnerships that help move money into sustainable infrastructure and climate action projects. And previously, Philip worked at the World Economic Forum, where he helped pioneer the idea of, quote, blended finance that's using a mix of public, philanthropic, and private capital to unlock investment in emerging markets and environmentally focused initiatives. He's also a member of our Washington Post Intelligence, Energy, and Climate Council, and he's joining us from Lausanne, Switzerland. Welcome, Philip. We're so glad you're here.
Thank you. Delighted to join you.
Wonderful. And Fred Hutchison is joining us. He is president of LNG Allies, an LNG exporter industry trade association. And as we will see, LNG exporters have a lot at stake in this discussion. And he's joining us from the Washington, D.C. area. Thank you for joining us, Fred.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to join in this discussion.
Wonderful. So here's how we'll organize our conversation for the next hour. First, we're going to talk broadly about the EPA data program that's ending and why it's ending. Secondly, we'll dive into what the data gap will mean for U.S. energy industry and the carbon management sector and investors. And third, we'll talk about what could replace the existing system. And lastly, we'll discuss recommendations for how companies, investors, and other stakeholders can navigate this moment. And I'd like to thank our audience for the questions that you sent in ahead of the briefing. We've used them to help shape this conversation. And throughout the conversation, I invite you to drop your questions and comments into the chat, and we'll take relevant questions as we go along. We'll also reserve time toward the end of the briefing in case there are additional questions. So with that, let's dive right in. Kathryn, as you mentioned, you recently published a report on our platform. It was called Surviving the Impending Climate Data Gap. And you wrote that the EPA is stepping away from collecting greenhouse gas emissions data, a program that it's been doing for 14 years. And as you mentioned, collecting data from more than 8,000 industrial sites nationwide. So tell us a bit more about how this program worked, when it's going to stop, and why.
Yeah, those are exactly the right questions. So, Luiza, the first thing to note is that this is actually an ongoing rulemaking process. So, when I talk about the impending data gap, I'm speaking about preparing for the worst outcome, which is that the administration does, in fact, end the program. In fact, where we are in the process is in March, the whole industry sector, all of the economy was really surprised by the administration's announcement from the EPA that they would be proposing an end to the program. This is not something that industry sought. From my reporting, I understand that almost everyone in the industry was very surprised by this move. It was not seen as an overly burdensome requirement by any voices in industry that I have talked to. And instead, it is really a paperwork exercise. It's a lot of information that companies would be collecting anyway, information about how they use energy, their fuel bills, et cetera. And it's mainly just giving that paperwork and that simple information to the government annually, and that satisfies the requirement. The fact that the program has been proposed for an end has caught a lot of comments. There was a public hearing in early October, and I believe one out of the many dozens of folks that came to testify actually spoke in favor of ending the program. So the program has widespread support from not just the environmental community, but the business community, investors, citizen groups. And so there is a chance that the program might survive. The comment period is still open, but I think that most of us, if we were to place a bet, looking at the administration's posture on climate, do anticipate that the program will end, and it could end as early as the end of this calendar year.
And so what are the reasons or rationale that the administration has given for ending the program?
Well, we've seen that the administration has done similar things, rolling back data collection at NOAA, for example, NSF programs that were designed to accumulate data to make better assessments of what's happening with our climate. And it seems to be consistent with an approach of ending measurement of a problem that the administration has very clearly and for a long time expressed that they do not believe is a legitimate issue, and that's climate change. So there's an old saying that you can't change what you don't measure. And I think the administration is very savvy in understanding that one of the most powerful ways that you can weaken climate change programs is by denying them the data that shows whether or not those programs are working.
Mm-hmm. You talk about, 8,000 industrial sites nationwide. Can you just give us more of a picture of what this is tracking, what kinds of industrial sites, what kinds of industries have been participating in this program?
Absolutely. This is a program that is reaching the very largest industrial sector. So this is not something that a local mom and pop business would be covered by. We're talking about the largest industrial sites. So think about steel production, oil refining, power plants of natural gas or coal. Anything that is a large-scale industrial site, whether it's chemical manufacturing, food processing, so really widely across the economy, major industrial facilities have participated in this program on an annual basis for 14 years.
I'm going to bring Fred in here as one of our industry representatives. And Fred, we know that this administration has tried to be very industry friendly. It's been trying to incentivize more energy development. Kathryn said this was a move that industry didn't ask for. Do you agree with that?
Industry didn't ask for it, but I think the premise on this move is maybe a little bit different, at least as we understand it. You have to remember that in the energy space in particular, there have been a couple of Supreme Court decisions in the last couple of years that have really changed the landscape completely. One was the Loper-Bright Supreme Court decision that overturned the Chevron doctrine, which said that the courts should defer to federal executive branch agencies to interpret and implement laws that are a little bit vague. The Loper-Bright decision really completely changed that situation. What it really says is that it's up to Congress to pass clear laws. And where those laws aren't clear, the courts should no longer defer as completely and totally as they have in the past to agency decisions. So what this administration did from the beginning, and I know it's the case at EPA, I've had decisions at very high levels there, they really looked at their, in light of Loper-Bright and in light of the other decision, which was the 7 counties decision with regard to upstream and downstream issues that said really you can't look outside the jurisdiction of your agency. The administration really looked at its a number of its programs, but many at EPA, and wondered what is our statutory authority exactly on this. And their decision to end the greenhouse gas reporting program, at least in part, as it's been explained to me, had to do with the fact that they don't think there's sufficient statutory authority for that. Look, that's something that we probably agree with. I can tell you, is this something that the industry would have, at least the oil and gas industry and the LNG industry, have looked to the federal government to lead and run? No, we would not have. Nonetheless, as Kathryn said, we have 14 years of data. So.
Right. And Philip, tell us about how this data was collected and used and shared by investors and by markets.
Yeah, well, I mean, effectively, this information was wrapped up in terms of companies, investors looking at developing indexes or screens for investments at the corporate level. So the database provided a mechanism to more readily access the data, to bake that into their investment screens and decisions, and ensure there was a degree of verification and credibility attached to them. given that it's gold standard. Now, any movement away from kind of that centralized repository of information creates a series of issues for companies who are looking to invest in low carbon projects, as well as those that are operating carbon management projects where they need to benchmark and validate that data. Effectively, what this move would do is erode some of the confidence that investors have around deploying their capital to projects, basing the feedback on decisions coming through voluntary reporting mechanisms as opposed to this particular framework. And as Kathryn mentioned before, the consistency of the trends. Losing this data is one of the ways that we can track where we are from a carbon management standpoint. And lastly, it's going to be an added cost for investors to try and understand where are the sources of data that they can use to bridge the gap moving forward. So all in all, I think it's somewhat of a problematic issue. I wouldn't say that it's going to break the investment strategies of some of these funds, investors, and banks. However, it is going to create additional impediments and further costs.
Mm-hmm. And that's a great segue into sort of our next topic, which is diving into some of these impacts. What will losing this data do? And Kathryn, one area that you highlighted in your report was impacts on clean energy tax credits, specifically the ones that managed to survive cancellation in the latest congressional legislation. So can you tell us more about these tax credits and why this data is relevant?
Yes, absolutely. I think it also bears noting to pivot off of something that Fred shared. We know this administration is really embracing efficiency and is trying to cut programs that are not aligned with its priorities. So I think that it's quite likely that the administration did not fully appreciate the impact that the greenhouse gas reporting program had as a tool for industry. And it may just be as simple as that. If that's the case, I think there's a chance that we can communicate through comments. Industry players will be able to make their voices heard. On the tax credits, interestingly, some of the tax credits that fared the best and did emerge as aligned with the administration's priorities were the tax credits for hydrogen and for carbon management. The tricky part that comes back to the greenhouse gas reporting program is that both of those programs in Treasury's guidance refer specifically to the industry providing their submission to the greenhouse gas reporting program as a part of the process of receiving those tax credits. So it is not impossible that Treasury could write new guidance and develop a new way, but it introduces a lot of uncertainty in the near term, and it probably will mean recreating a lot of what we were doing at the greenhouse gas program to begin with, just having to repurpose it specifically for Treasury.
That is really interesting. And so those tax credits for hydrogen and carbon, who's impacted by that?
Well, I'm going to turn to Philip to talk a little bit about what he sees moving in this industry. But I understand from my reporting that it is a $77.5 billion industry just this year alone and growing. It's an emerging industry. This includes not just carbon capture and storage, but also direct air capture of carbon. There are a lot of startups and interesting companies that are entering this space every month, and it has a great potential for economic development and job creation. So it's a new industry.
But aren't also oil and gas companies involved in a lot of these carbon capture projects, right? Like that's
a great point.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. Well,
yeah.
I think that's a great segue to bring in Philip. So what are the impacts on the carbon management industry? You hinted at this a little bit, but maybe you could kind of make it a little bit more tangible about where this data played into how the industry functions.
Yeah, look, I think this has impacts both on the investment side, on the financing side, as well as on the product side for individual companies. So as Kathryn was alluding to, these tax credits, particularly on the carbon management, from a carbon management perspective, don't just affect renewable energy projects. In fact, they are more oriented towards industries that generate a significant amount of emissions and are looking for ways to manage their carbon more effectively. So in the past, I've seen projects in everything from oil and gas through direct air capture will be affected by this, as well as other industries that may not come top of mind, but agriculture, the timber and paper processing industries are all involved with projects at the moment that are looking to benefit from these tax credits. So it has far-reaching consequences from a industrial perspective, from an investment and from a financing perspective. As I said, I think as Kathryn mentioned before, this data isn't necessarily going to be lost. It's just going to be fragmented, and the process of having to collect all that data and aggregate it is going to fall on investors. So that will result in increased financing costs for projects and companies that are looking to build out these projects. The fact that they may not be able to trigger their tax credits when they expect them to be triggered is also going to push out the returns for projects and have increased impacts from a viability standpoint, as well as potentially reducing the returns that companies can expect to see from these projects. So all in all, I think all is not lost if this goes through, but it's certainly going to affect the whole value chain from the capital deployment to the boots and shovels in the ground.
Got it. Fred, one area that Kathryn mentioned in her report was the LNG industry. And can you talk a little bit about what this means for your member companies and in particular for exporters?
Well, absolutely. We have, as an association, sponsored for the last 4 years a very interesting project to benchmark U.S. LNG exports, the greenhouse gas emissions intensity against exports from other LNG producers, gas by pipeline from Russia, Turkmenistan, Algeria, and coal in the 13 top global LNG markets. That particular program developed for us by the Berkeley Research Group was a core part of our mission as an association, and it relied entirely on the EPA data. And if I remember correctly, even the data that was used for pipeline gas in countries such as Russia and Algeria, that data is from the International Energy Agency, the IEA, and that data is also uses the EPA methodology. So it's an important tool for us. But let me come back to a couple of things that I've been saying consistently publicly. This data and this information is incredibly important because it shows the amazing progress that the oil and gas industry in the United States and the LNG industry have made in reducing its greenhouse gas emissions, particularly when it comes to methane and methane leaks. That 14 years of data has been very important. We're working very closely with the American Petroleum Institute and other trade associations to preserve and protect the oil and gas portion of that data. Listen, we can't speak to the cement or the steel or the power industries, but with regard to oil and gas, the trends and the record and the data are very important. I know that we are collectively downloading that data and intend to preserve it. Now, I would say that again, I go back to the point of, is this a program that the industry would have felt the federal government should have done? No, we're not in disagreement with the administration on that starting point, but with that 14 years of data, we think it's going to be important to us from a market perspective on LNG to have it available. But I would say there's a couple of other things to keep in mind, at least with regard to the Subpart W part of that program, which relates to the oil and gas industry. The industry came together in a joint trades submission to the Biden EPA when that program was up for review in 22 or 23. So any continuation that the industry might pursue with regard to our piece of the collection of that data, I would have to be, yes, it would be voluntary. I couldn't be mandatory. As no way that any of our associations or anyone outside the federal government has a ability to compel people to comply. But so it would be voluntary, but it would also be adjusted in a way that would reflect the priorities and the sensible tweaks that the industry proposed back to EPA a couple of years ago. But do we anticipate that we will find a way, working with the right kind of partners, whether it's the Colorado School of Mines, the University of Texas at Austin, the Gas Technology Institute, and others, to continue to have that available, at least that data available, at least with regard to the oil and gas and the LNG industries.
Mm-hmm. Kathryn, one of the points you'd made in your report about LNG was potential impact on exports to Europe. Can you flesh that out?
Yes, we are coming up on a very important new regulation, a new regulatory regime in the EU, where any imports of LNG will need to be able to demonstrate that their associated greenhouse gas emissions, or as Fred used the term greenhouse gas intensity, are at least equal to or less than, in terms of carbon intensity, to EU sources of natural gas. So the greenhouse gas reporting program provided a ready-made way for the American industry as a whole to argue that we as a whole in the United States have very strict environmental regulations. We have the methane rules against the leakages that Fred just referred to. And on the strength of that, we should be able to get from the EU a determination that any U.S. producer of natural gas that is exporting to the EU should have that waived, which should not have to be able to again prove on a tanker by tanker basis that they're in compliance, because by the fact that they are an American producer, the greenhouse gas reporting program could have helped us establish that. In the absence of that program, I think there are a lot of important questions about how companies will be able to provide that level of granularity so that they can account for greenhouse gas emissions on a tank load by tank load basis. As Fred and Philip have both said, there's nothing that is a showstopper about losing the greenhouse gas reporting program. It's just about lost efficiencies and more cost to industry and having to produce the data on their own without the strength of the federal government behind them.
Mm-hmm. Fred, do you want to add anything on this question of exports to Europe and the new regulatory regime coming there?
Yeah, I sure do. So with regard to the EU methane regulation, which let's just call it UMR for simplicity's sake, we are in touch nearly daily with the EU delegation office in Washington, D.C., the member states from the affected countries, whether they're in Eastern Europe or Netherlands or Germany or France or Italy. We had meetings this week with our counterparts from the IOGP Brussels office and others on working through this. Fundamentally, the United States and the European Union are absolutely on the same page with respect to a number of things. First of all, U.S. LNG has become very important to the energy security of Europe. The structure of our system, where there are limited destination restrictions, meant that our gas could flow to Europe when it was needed, following Russia's invasion of Ukraine. That's been incredibly important over the last 3.5 years. So we're in a complete agreement on that. We are in complete agreement that the EUMR will not in any way impede the ability of the United States to continue to be the guarantor of global energy security and Europe's energy security in particular. There are a number of very important and creative ways to address the EUMR challenges. It essentially requires a eventual end user of gas in Europe to provide evidence to the competent authorities in the country where they're headquartered that the gas they're receiving is of a low emissions gas. Well, 25% of our gas in the United States every single day, more than double the amount that we export, comes from producers who are low emissions producers that have their production independently verified, certified, and audited. So the fact that we have so much gas leaving, being produced that's low emissions gas, we're talking and getting good success with the Europeans on looking at what could be, for regard to that reporting requirement, perhaps what's called a book and claim system, not unlike what happens on electricity. If you want to go to Pepco and buy green electrons, you can do that. Well, that's that certificate and that guarantee that their low emission electrons are actually separated from the electrons themselves. What you simply have is a system to make sure that you're not double counting, that you're not gaming the system. That's a pretty simple system to produce. On the reporting piece, we think that's a way we can approach that. One other thing I would say on this particular topic is that the law, the EUMR, came together through the EU makes law in an even more cumbersome and many times inexplicable way than we do here in the United States. And we think that there are some really fundamental flaws with that legislation. And as they go through what's called an omnibus procedure next year, we think that this, along with some other issues, will be revisited.
So it's definitely keeping you busy, it sounds like. Well, before we move on to more of the nuts and bolts of what could replace this data and how industry and investors will be looking for alternatives, we have an audience member who has asked if there are any impacts on citizens or communities. How do we see this issue affecting individuals and families on a smaller scale? Are there things communities should be doing that can counteract the impact these changes will have on their lives? Would anyone like to take a stab at that?
Well, I can start to address that. I appreciate the question, and I think where the question may be coming from is that in some cases, scientists rely on citizens to be an extension of their scientific staff, take temperature readings of bodies of water or get air samples. This is really quite different than what we're talking about with some of those citizen science initiatives. This greenhouse gas reporting program was based on what otherwise would be proprietary data on things like how much fuel an industrial facility is buying. So it's not information that would be available to the public. And so there isn't, to me, an obvious way that the public or the communities could fill the gap. In the sense of how our communities impacted, not directly. There is, I think, an indirect effect on communities that might have a concern about climate change, that this does just complicate the programs that are designed to address emissions. I know some state programs refer to our national greenhouse gas inventory to benchmark how they're doing against other states, or they have done that to date and perhaps won't be able to in the future. But in terms of household level or community level impacts, I don't believe there'll be any direct impacts.
Gotcha. So I want to move on to kind of what happens now and what comes next. And we do have an audience question asking, can we fill the gap on the short term from data collected and analyzed by other countries? And along those lines, we had another question come in. Even if not needed domestically, are not many of these businesses globally active, so they may need the data globally?
Yeah, I can try to speak to that as well. So under the UN framework for climate change negotiations, all countries that are a party to that agreement must submit reports on what their own emissions are. And so the questioner is right that many of these companies are global companies, and the fact that they may not be required to report in the United States does not negate their responsibilities to report in other countries where they may operate. But it is not the kind of data set that can be replicated by extrapolating from what countries are doing overseas, or I'm sorry, what companies are doing overseas. This is a data set that was based on not extrapolation, but real world reports based on measurable things like energy inputs and actual chemical outputs. So there isn't a way to extrapolate in a way from other countries to fill the gap that would remain. I think what we're likely to see, and I know we're going to talk a little bit more about this, is, as Fred mentioned, there are creative ways of coming up with perhaps voluntary programs, looking at the problem a little differently, but the way that the data works, it's specific to the United States.
Gotcha. Philip, do you want to add to that, how it looks from a global perspective, and then maybe talk a little bit at what you started to mention, which is how are investors going to be approaching this data? Will they be going to some third-party source for reliable data? Will they be collecting the data themselves? Are we going to have some kind of a patchwork system? Or is it likely that one entity will emerge as a sort of third-party, standard for this kind of data?
Quite a broad range of topics to address. I'll start with the question, in terms of the impact of foreign countries to try and collect some of this data. There are different types of reporting mechanisms that are required. For example, the carbon border adjustment mechanism, which is going to come into force in 2026. Reporting is already required from those industries that are importing into the European Union, which are carbon intensive. Through that reporting mechanism and the benchmarking relative to the emissions of similarly produced products in the European Union, we should get a sense from certain types of US companies as to what their emissions load looks like as relates to the materials. I do want to also just mention the fact that, despite the fact that there may not be a holistic approach on a global level to look at this, there is a patchwork approach that could be used as a basis in the United States, with a number of different states having reporting requirements that could fill in some of the gaps. But as a whole, I think we are looking at a patchwork approach to try and find actual data as well as proxy data that will tell us what the emissions are at these different facilities. Now, in terms of investors and how they're going to be approaching this, we have for some time been increasing the amount of data that's available through satellites, for example. I think we're going to see a greater reliance on those. There may be opportunities for companies to monetize their reporting, to basically sell access to their reporting data to investors to ensure that they meet various different criteria. I don't think we are going to see one company be the repository for all this data. We are going to probably have a few gaps in there with certain industries not reporting. I think fortunately we have the majority of the Fortune 1000 companies in the US at the moment that are voluntarily reporting on this information. So we do have to hope that continues. But in summary, we're looking at a patchwork of different sovereign, state-led, as well as voluntary reporting initiatives. And that's where the cost is really going to factor in for investors as they try to figure out how to standardize this data and how to collect it all.
Mm-hmm. And what about from your perspective, Freddie? You started to tell us that there were creative ways that your industry was looking at to address the data question.
Well, again, I think the oil and gas industry feels like we have an enormous story to tell here. And look, you have to remember that this system tracks greenhouse gases generally. So the most important of those, at least with respect to the oil and gas industry, are methane and methane emissions and the carbon dioxide emissions that might come at an LNG facility, for example, when a portion of the LNG, the natural gas that's coming into the facility, is burned at that facility to be put to work in the refrigeration units. So LNG is natural gas with the non-methane components, nitrogen, butane, propane, ethane stripped out, and then chilled to minus 258 degrees Fahrenheit. So it's a lot of energy. About 10% of the natural gas that comes into the projects is actually combusted and used to chill the natural gas to LNG. So for us, it's both carbon dioxide emissions, methane emissions. The greenhouse gas reporting system was sort of a one-stop shop for that. There are thresholds with regard to this, with regard to the oil and gas industry, and I think all the other industries. It's not mom and pop operations. It is the largest facilities. It applies on a facility by facility basis. So that's how you are swept up into the program. Look, we think that the industry can organize itself in a way that it can continue to voluntarily collect and in a transparent way make that data available, again, so that we can continue to track the trends, so that we can continue to see the progress that's made primarily in methane reductions. Satellites can be helpful, as are aerial flyovers and other sorts of means, but in many cases they don't track with the on-the-ground data. So we're on top of it. As Kathryn said at the beginning, we're in the middle of a comment period. That comment period hasn't closed. I would imagine that there'll be a joint submission on behalf of a number of associations, ours included, with regard to that. And we will find some way to keep our portion of this going. It's important to the industry, and I think there's very close to a unanimous view among all the principal players that this should continue.
Mm-hmm. Fred, you talked about the good story that natural gas producers have to tell about the reduction in emissions and in methane control. Does it get harder to tell that story when the data is self-reported as opposed to from a third party, be it the government or some other entity that doesn't have a stake in what the numbers are kind of coming out and certifying these are, in fact, this is the progress that's being made?
Well, of course, that's always a challenge in these sorts of things. I mean, the principal criticism that people threw at us when we made the results of our greenhouse gas intensity benchmarking framework that BRG did for us was that, oh, you shouldn't pay any attention to these guys. This is from the industry. Don't dig into the methodology. Don't make a look at it. Don't ask whether what we've done. But so yes, that's always an issue that we have to deal with. But look, if we partner with the right kind of partners, whether they are like I said, universities, whether they are great industry organizations like the Gas Technology Institute, which is now just called GTI, out of Chicago, and others in this space, we think it'll have a lot of credibility to it. And again, our intent, if you're going to maintain the trend information, you're going to have to track the methodology of what the EPA was doing relatively closely. Again, we think that there were some specific tweaks with which we wanted. Back in 23, we would want to make those tweaks, but you want to have some general data consistency so that you can maintain some accuracy and some credibility on the trend lines.
Got it. So it sounds like there may be a role for universities here in particular. Kathryn, in your report, you had a few recommendations for stakeholders who are impacted by this potential change. Can you walk through what they should be doing right now and in the next few months?
I think this is a great segue from what Fred was just sharing, because a lot of knowledge went into evolving the way that the greenhouse gas reporting program went as industries changed, as technologies evolved. Industry groups would share that knowledge and petition the EPA to change the way that their emissions were being attributed to them. There are things called emission factors, without getting too far into the weeds, where you could report to the industry what kind of technology you were using, and there would be you could say we have these number of these kind of valves in our system, and that would equate to an emissions factor. So as your technology changed and your valves improved, for example, you might go back and argue for a better way of attributing those emissions. There were so many conversations over 14 years to evolve the way that data was taken. And if we move to a patchwork approach, one of the requirements or one of the recommendations that I have for companies is to make sure that your experts are up to speed, because fortunately or unfortunately, we will have a number of arenas where you're going to have to make those same arguments all over again. And you're going to want to make sure that any new reporting scheme that your company is a part of gets those emission factors correct. This is also incredibly important for addressing the fact that we're going to have a multiple suite of different reporting regimes, the patchwork, as Philip said. If we don't have agreed upon ways of measuring emissions, we're not going to be able to do apples to apples comparisons, and that will introduce all kinds of inefficiencies into the system. So my number one recommendation is to make sure those subject matter experts are up to speed, that they understand, for example, the tweaks that Fred was talking about. Make sure that they're very current in their understanding of the technologies and what that means for emissions accounting. I'd be remiss to not just say again that, it is a comment period that's currently open. This is not a done deal. And there's an opportunity for companies that have a perspective on this to submit comments to the EPA on this proceeding. So I think the last thing that I would share is that if you are a part of an industry association, in carbon-intensive industries, this is very likely going to be a major source of discussion within your industry group. If you want to be part of shaping how your industry responds and comes up with its own way to address its data gap, you'll want to be at the table for those discussions.
That's great. Philip, what about you? From where you sit, what should investors and people in the carbon management industry be doing right now as this new rule takes shape and potentially does away with this data?
Well, look, I think it's imperative time to make sure that we don't get caught short-handed and have a drop-off of the data. So it's incumbent on us as the investment community to start putting these mechanisms together that can start aggregating data from different sources. I look at some of the voluntary initiatives that have been active in the space, like the Science-Based Targets Initiative, which many companies are reporting under today, various different industry groups like Ceres in the United States that are actively looking for solutions to this. But as you alluded to, I think it's going to take a collaborative effort from a variety of different sources, everyone from SpaceX and their satellite network to the universities, to companies on the ground, state governments as well, who will be collecting reporting data. New York, California, New Jersey all have acts that are passing through right now, which will be big contributors to this. And I think to echo what Fred is alluding to at the moment, it's incumbent on the investors to talk with the different industry associations and have them understand the necessity and the importance of maintaining that consistency of data, so that we can see the trend line, so that we can make the decisions as to where and how we're going to deploy our capital. But it's a bit of a rush, and it's going to be quite costly, I assume, in the coming months to put something comprehensive together to fill this gap.
Well, Philip, what I'm hearing from you and from the other conversation is just the patchwork piece of this. It's both time sensitive. People are rushing to make sure that there's not going to be a gap in the data. Are these people in industries talking to one another? And if so, what is the forum for that sort of connection and exchange of planning and ideas? Or does that forum not exist? Is there someone who could be, leading these conversations and bringing people together? How does that even start?
I mean, that's a great question. I'd probably defer to Fred, who probably has a little more insight as to the amount of engagement across industry. From what I've seen in the past, there are different associations that can bring these industry groups together. I don't know how regularly they are engaged and whether this is high on their agenda. But obviously there are initiatives under the auspices of various different international business organizations, everyone from the OECD, I imagine, to the World Economic Forum that could act as convener. I think the sense of urgency is not something that I've heard to date. I think that's one of the reasons why this report is so poignant and timely. And I think this is a great reminder to different organizations to try and step in and fill the gap and bring these different industry associations together. Hopefully the WP Intelligence can also act as a bit of a forum or a source to help facilitate this conversation.
No, absolutely. That's why we're having this conversation. Fred, how does it look from where you sit? Are there other industries that are talking to you? Is there some third party that's bringing everyone together, say, hey, it's all in our collective interest to have consistency across this data? What's the reality?
Well, the reality is that this particular thing is just as all over the map as everything else in Washington, D.C. at the moment. Look, this doesn't rise to the level of the European CSDD requirements, which you all have been reading about recently, and that joint letter from Qatar's energy minister and Secretary Wright. Those are issues that are really rise to the very top of the boardrooms across the industries. What I would say is that we can expect that there will be some of those conversations. National Association of Manufacturers, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, they are the broad convening kind of power to do that. I don't anticipate that. We have already in the U.S. oil and gas industry, our act together. We are having these discussions. Executive committees have met, had these discussions. We're going to find a path forward. But from a broad basis, I think everybody is wondering who to talk to in Congress and who can you talk to in the administration and who's been furloughed and when will they be back and is it going to be a happy Thanksgiving and a Merry Christmas and or will we be pondering this in the new year? So I don't know.
Absolutely. Philip, I have two questions here from the audience that maybe I'll direct to you since you've referenced satellites a couple times. Someone is asking, satellites have been referenced several times, but isn't funding for them going away as well? And someone else asked, how do the withdrawals from the science-based target initiatives affect this? So sort of both questions about cutbacks in government funding for science and for satellite.
Yeah, I mean, certainly the cutbacks from a public sector perspective are, not what we would want to see, given this impending data gap. There are satellite companies that are actively looking to generate data, use their mapping systems either for monitoring, reporting, verification on various different activities, or simply to aggregate that data. So there are opportunities for satellites to be used to collect that data and to fill this data gap. However, the simple fact is with decline in public funding, we're probably going to have less data than we had ordinarily. As far as the SBTI is concerned, the Science-Based Targets Initiative withdrawals, I mean, every withdrawal from a voluntary reporting initiative obviously is also negatively impacting our ability to develop that patchwork of data sets. There are, what I've seen from talking particularly to companies in the finance and insurance industries is that they are continuing to look at their emissions. They're continuing to try and gather data to feed into their models. They may not necessarily do that under the auspices of a voluntary reporting initiative, but that data is still going to be collected. I think what I have been hearing is that particularly on the insurance side, there's a tremendous interest in increasing the amount of data that they are collecting with regards to both climate-based impacts as well as emissions data to feed into their data models. So I think we're going to have to lean a little bit into industry, into different companies to try and collect their data and have them provide it to us. But again, the challenge is, as Fred was alluding to, that much of this data tends to be proprietary, and so unless we're paying for it, we might have some even greater data gaps than we anticipated.
That is fascinating, the role that the insurance industry could be playing in these discussions. That's a really interesting angle. Well, in all of our briefings, I like to just take a few minutes to talk about what you're all doing next and what you're watching. So Kathryn, why don't we start with you? What's your next report going to be on for our subscribers?
Great, thanks, Luiza. Yeah, so I'm working now on a report looking at a very exciting geologic formation in the south of the United States called the Smackover Foundation. This was an oil and gas deposit. It's been exploited for bromine in the past, but last year the USGS, the U.S. Geological Survey, made headlines when they announced that it could be one of the world's largest reserves of lithium. What's interesting about it is that a lot of the infrastructure and the skill sets and the expertise from the oil and gas sector might be very directly transferable to exploiting this resource. So I'm looking forward to diving into that a little bit more.
And absolutely part of ongoing coverage that we've been doing of critical minerals, and particularly their implications for defense and technology and the relationship with China. Philip, what about you? What are you working on next, or what should we be watching for next?
Well, interestingly enough, I'm actually working on the opposite of what we're discussing here, which is the emergence of reporting requirements for emissions in other countries around the world. We're also seeing the push forward for certain jurisdictions to start exploring carbon markets. You're seeing activity, particularly in the MENA region and out in Asia. So there are activities that will impact multinational companies based in the United States moving forward that are perhaps inverse to this trend that we're discussing today.
That's fascinating. And Fred, how about you?
Oh gosh, we're working on about, I don't know, somewhere between 200 and 300 different things, I guess. We're deep into, as I mentioned, discussions with the the EU on the EU methane regulation. So that's number one. We're looking at a number of other very specific situations. We are in, this administration is, as you know, bent effort backwards to be helpful to the U.S. LNG industry. We asked for 4 specific ways for them to return to regular order and make the regulatory process more certain. They adopted all of those. We're going to be focusing a lot on how the various other parts of the federal government, such as the Department of Commerce, the Development Finance Corporation, the Export-Import Bank of the United States, might help with development of global gas infrastructure. We've got the gas, we've got the facilities that are producing, and we'll soon be producing more of it. So we need to get on with getting the infrastructure built, in large part from a climate perspective, to begin to move the rest of the world from coal to gas, which, as you all know, produces about half the greenhouse gas emissions on a fuel basis than coal.
Well, thank you so much, Fred and Philip and Kathryn, for joining us today. This is obviously an issue we'll continue to cover closely at WP Intelligence. And I'd like to remind the audience that you can request a WP Intelligence platform demo by clicking the link on your screen. And please block your calendar for Fridays at 11 a.m. Eastern. This is our regular briefing slot. And next week, I'll be joined by our lead AI and tech analyst, Jason Dean, and we'll talk about the implications of AI and the future of robotics. This has big impacts on the US economy and on a wide range of industries, and also on the state of our global competitiveness. So in the meantime, we'll send you a link to a recording of this briefing that you can share. And please take a moment to fill out the short post-briefing survey that we send out every week. Your input really helps us understand how we can serve you best and shapes what comes next. So thanks so much for joining us. Have a wonderful weekend, and we'll see you next Friday.